In crowded households, one rack might hold only a few precious cloths, and each was used by multiple women. Daughters took them after mothers, servants after mistresses, and visitors were sometimes handed the same towel that had been used the night before for something altogether private. No one washed them thoroughly. Washing was feared for its roughness, believed to fray the fabric and shorten the towel's life. Instead, towels were rinsed lightly, wrung out, and hung in stuffy rooms to dry. The dampness never fully disappeared. Mould crept into the fibres, giving them a faint sour smell that was masked with perfume or ignored entirely. The risks multiply with every use. Skin infections spread rapidly, from mild rashes to fungal outbreaks that lingered for weeks. Intimate use of these cloths left women vulnerable to bacterial infections, which in some cases became severe. Yet silence surrounded the practice. To admit such problems would mean admitting to habits no one wanted to discuss. Women endured in silence, scratching at itches, nursing secret sores, and masking discomfort behind powdered faces. Servants bore the heaviest burden. They were responsible for rinsing and rehanging the towels, often with bare hands, their fingers cracking from constant exposure to cold water. The same hands prepared food and cared for children, carrying contamination from cloth to table and back again. The irony is painful. The very objects that symbolized refinement became the most efficient carriers of disease in the household. If we compare this to today, it would be like a family sharing the same makeup wipe for their faces, feet, and private parts, then hanging it on the dining table to dry before dinner. The cycle extended beyond hygiene. Towels hung to dry were often confused with cloths used for other household purposes. In kitchens and dining rooms, they were sometimes snatched up to wipe spills or polish cutlery. Guests unknowingly dabbed their lips with cloths that had hours earlier been pressed to a mistress's body. The overlap between hygiene and dining blurred, creating a constant loop of contamination that few recognized but everyone endured. The contradictions were striking. These towels, imported at great expense, were meant to signal cleanliness and sophistication. Yet their very misuse guaranteed the opposite. Their softness trapped moisture and filth, their delicacy discouraged proper washing, and their prestige blinded families to the dangers they carried. To the outside eye, a rack of Turkish towels suggested elegance. In truth, it was an exhibition of disease disguised as refinement. Doctors occasionally encountered the consequences. Women came to them with rashes, infections, and fevers. Yet social codes forbade frank discussion of personal hygiene. Physicians diagnosed female weakness or nervous complaints, prescribing rest or tonics. The possibility that the towels were responsible was never mentioned. The silence of the household extended to the silence of medicine. I find it disturbing to imagine these fine cloths, admired for their beauty, yet serving as silent threads binding families together in cycles of sickness. Generations repeated the habit. Mothers instructed daughters to handle the towels with care, not because of germs, but because of the fabric's value. Lessons focused on preserving the cloth, not protecting the body. Young women inherited not only the towels themselves, but also the rituals that surrounded them, perpetuating the same risks. The result was a lineage of refinement built on decay, where silence and pride ensured that mistakes became tradition. The story of Turkish towels is not simply about one object. It is about how wealth and ignorance combined to create rituals of harm. It shows how luxury could mask decay, how silence could transform filth into tradition, and how even the most beautiful possessions could become tools of suffering. The towels, admired for their patterns and origins, became silent carriers of infection, their threads woven as much with danger as with silk. The image that lingers is not of elegance but of contradiction. Women rubbing their cheeks with the same cloth that had cleaned their bodies, servants hanging damp towels beside dining linens, and households perfumed with lavender in futile attempts to cover the sour smell of mildew. These details reveal the truth of Victorian hygiene. appearance mattered far more than reality, and luxury often hid decay. The misuse of Turkish towels reminds us that refinement without understanding is only a mask, fragile and dangerous. It shows us how rituals, once accepted, can endure despite their harm, and how silence allows mistakes to grow into traditions. It also reveals the fragile line between beauty and filth, a line crossed daily in households that prided themselves on their sophistication. The story of these towels is part of the wider pattern of Victorian life, where luxury objects promised progress but delivered suffering. They teach us that wealth does not guarantee wisdom, and that silence can make even the simplest habits deadly. In the end, these towels were not symbols of cleanliness but of the constant tension between appearance and truth. The practice of sharing and misusing Turkish towels left women vulnerable to infections, servants burdened with dangerous tasks, and households plagued by cycles of hidden illness. It serves as one more reminder of how refinement, when built on ignorance, conceals not purity but decay. These towels, admired for their beauty and treated as treasures, left behind a legacy not of elegance but of harm. They reveal how appearances shaped daily life, and how silence preserved traditions that eroded health. In this way, they join the long list of objects in Victorian hygiene that promised refinement while delivering suffering. The use of Turkish towels as all-purpose cloths reveals how fragile the boundary between luxury and decay truly was, and within the same households, another practice took root, where even gloves, symbols of gentleness and elegance, were misused in ways that spread more harm than comfort. Oil lamps filled with fragrant substances stood in many Victorian households, their light flickering softly in bedrooms and private chambers. They were not only used for illumination but also for rituals that blended beauty with danger. Among the nobility, there arose a strange belief that the scented smoke rising from these lamps could cleanse the body and improve allure. Women, guided by advice passed in whispers, began to place the lamps beneath them, allowing the heat and vapours to rise toward the most sensitive parts of their bodies. To them, it seemed like a method of refinement, a way to add an invisible fragrance to their very skin. Yet what they endured was not a harmless ritual, but a practice that left burns, pain, and scars. The oils chosen for these lamps were expensive and exotic: ambergris from the ocean, resins from distant forests, and fragrant woods reduced to oil were poured carefully into the burners. The price of these substances marked status, and women believed that by exposing themselves to the vapours, they absorbed the luxury directly. The ritual was treated as an act of elegance, a secret that promised beauty beyond what powders and perfumes could deliver. It is almost absurd to imagine women sitting over smoking lamps as though roasting themselves for the sake of refinement. The process was both awkward and painful. Women removed layers of fabric, positioned themselves above the rising smoke, and sat for long stretches of time. Servants were often nearby, instructed to tend the lamp and keep the oils burning. The air grew hot, the smoke dense, and the skin exposed to both. The initial warmth was interpreted as effectiveness, but as minutes turned into half an hour, the heat became unbearable. Flesh reddened, blistered, and in many cases burned deeply. Still, women endured, believing that the pain meant the treatment was working. The burns that resulted were severe. Doctors described blistering, peeling, and wounds that lingered for weeks. Some women could not walk comfortably, yet they concealed their suffering behind silence. To admit the injuries would be to confess to the ritual itself, which many feared would be judged improper. The scars left behind were permanent reminders of misplaced trust in tradition. If we compare this to today, it would be like women placing scented hair straighteners directly against their skin in the hope of absorbing perfume. The irony deepened when the oils themselves caused harm. Some resins released toxic fumes when burned, irritating the lungs and weakening the body. Women who endured these vapours complained of headaches, dizziness, and difficulty breathing. Yet the practice persisted, to appear fragrant, to claim refinement that extended even to the most hidden parts of the body, was worth any discomfort in their minds. Servants bore silent witness to these acts. They filled the lamps, trimmed the wicks, and wiped away the spills of oil. They smelled the sharp smoke that clung to fabrics and lingered in rooms. They knew the burns that followed, for they were often tasked with tending to wounds in secrecy. But to speak openly was unthinkable. Their silence kept the cycle alive, and their obedience made them unwilling accomplices in a ritual that harmed both body and dignity. The obsession with this ritual reflected a larger truth about Victorian ideals. Cleanliness was tied not to knowledge but to appearance and fragrance. A woman could suffer in private, blistered and scarred, but if she appeared composed in public and carried a faint scent of amber or resin, she was praised for refinement. The contradiction is chilling. Refinement came to mean pain, and elegance was bought with suffering. I find it unsettling to imagine elegant women enduring burns in silence simply to meet an impossible standard of beauty. Reports of harm did occasionally surface. Doctors treating burns noted the strange distribution of wounds, but rarely asked questions. To do so risked embarrassment for both physician and patient. Instead, they applied ointments, muttered vague diagnoses, and left the women to heal in silence. Newspapers, when they mentioned the dangers of perfumed oils, focused on fires and explosions rather than the quiet burns endured in private chambers. Thus, the truth remained hidden, unspoken, and unchallenged. The practice was not confined to one household. It spread through social circles, whispered as a secret of beauty. Daughters learned it from their mothers, and friends recommended it to one another. The belief in its effectiveness grew stronger with each repetition, even as the risks multiplied. The silence of women, the compliance of servants, and the ignorance of doctors combined to keep the ritual alive long past the point when its dangers should have been obvious. The lamps themselves became symbols of contradiction. Shining brass or copper bases supported glass bowls filled with oil. They looked elegant, smelled pleasant, and lit rooms with a steady glow. To guests, they were marks of refinement. To those who knew their hidden use, they were instruments of harm, sitting quietly on tables until called into service. The same lamp that illuminated a dinner table in the evening might burn flesh in a bedroom hours later. The story of these lamps tells us that luxury can mask danger, that beauty can conceal pain, and that silence can preserve rituals of suffering. It reveals the fragility of refinement, showing how easily appearance overtook reality. It also shows the cost of ignorance, for these women believed they were elevating themselves when in truth they were scarring themselves permanently. The image that lingers is vivid women seated over flickering lamps, smoke rising around them, skin blistering quietly while servants stand by with lowered eyes. The air thick with perfume could not disguise the smell of burning flesh, yet no one spoke. The lamps kept burning, the rituals continued, and the silence endured. The ritual of scented oil lamps was not merely a private eccentricity. It was a symbol of Victorian contradictions, where progress and refinement were praised even as harms spread unchecked. It teaches us that rituals without knowledge lead only to pain, and that silence can turn folly into tradition. These lamps, admired for their beauty and fragrance, left behind a legacy of scars. They remind us that refinement, when built on ignorance, carries with it the seeds of suffering. Their glow may have lit parlours and bedrooms, but their true light shines on the dangers of vanity unchecked by reason. The use of oil lamps for intimate fumigation left women burned, scarred, and silenced. It added one more layer to the long list of Victorian hygiene practices that promised elegance but delivered pain. And from these lamps, the pattern would continue, with even the simplest household items, like gloves, turned into tools of misguided refinement that spread harm instead of comfort. The story of scented oil lamps brings to an end another chapter of hidden suffering. It shows us how much people endured in the name of refinement, and how silence allowed harm to flourish. Yet it also prepares us to see the ways in which ordinary objects, even gloves meant for protection, became dangerous when misused in the same households. Swede gloves, finely stitched and imported at great expense, were once symbols of elegance in Victorian households. Women wore them to social events, admired them for their softness, and displayed them as markers of wealth. Yet in private chambers, far from the gaze of polite society, these same gloves were pressed into service for a very different purpose. Some women, finding coarse towels too harsh against sensitive skin, chose to slip their hands into these gloves, dip them into bowls of warm herbal water, and use them to clean their most delicate areas. It was a ritual born of fear of discomfort, wrapped in the trappings of refinement, but it became a habit that carried far greater risks than the roughness they sought to avoid. The gloves, made from soft suede, absorbed water quickly. Once soaked, they became sponges, holding within their fibres not only the scented herbs, but also everything they touched. A single use left them damp and heavy, streaked with residues invisible to the eye. Rather than being washed or boiled, they were left to dry slowly and then tucked into wooden boxes lined with silk. The boxes were meant to protect the fine leather, but in truth, they created dark, airless spaces where mould thrived. Each time the gloves were taken out again, they carried more than softness. They carried spores, bacteria, and the damp smell of decay. It is almost ridiculous to think of women treating these gloves as instruments of comfort, while they quietly turned into breeding grounds for sickness. The ritual repeated itself day after day. Women slipped on the same gloves, dipped them again into the herbal water, and trusted them to deliver gentleness. They valued the feeling of suede against skin, a smoothness that seemed luxurious compared to the scratch of coarse towels. The herbs gave off a faint fragrance, which masked the smell of mildew clinging to the gloves. What was meant to soothe, in fact, spread harm. But the illusion of refinement was stronger than suspicion. Servants played their role too. They prepared the bowls of warm water, steeping them with rosemary, lavender, or mint. They handed the gloves to their mistresses, waited in silence, and afterward were tasked with drying and storing them. Rarely did they wash them properly, either out of ignorance or because they were forbidden to risk damaging the delicate leather. Over time, the gloves stiffened, their seams weakened, and their insides darkened with residue. Yet they were used again and again until they fell apart. The danger grew worse when the gloves were not reserved for the mistress alone. Servants, left with the task of handling them, sometimes used them privately when their mistress was away. For women of lower rank, the gloves offered a rare chance at gentleness, even if borrowed in secrecy. They, too, dipped them into water and pressed them against their own skin, unaware that they were sharing not only fabric but also infection. If we compare this to today, it would be like multiple people secretly sharing the same damp sponge for personal hygiene, convinced it was a luxury, even as it carried disease. The infection spread quietly. Women who used the gloves developed itching, swelling, and rashes. Some suffered from recurrent fevers, their bodies weakened by bacteria entering through broken skin. Doctors, when consulted, spoke vaguely of female weakness, nervous strain, or unbalanced humours. They rarely suspected that the cause lay in something as refined as suede gloves. After all, gloves were symbols of gentility. To connect them with filth seemed impossible. The contradiction is sharp. Objects admired as luxury accessories in public were, in private, carriers of decay. What should have represented refinement became a pathway to illness. Women who prided themselves on their sensitivity and elegance were, in fact, exposing themselves to hidden dangers, wrapped in leather that softened to the touch, but hardened into sources of infection. I find it troubling to imagine these gloves, praised for their beauty, pressed again and again against skin while carrying silent harm. Generations carried on the practice. Mothers passed the habit to daughters, teaching them that soft gloves were gentler and more suitable than coarse towels. Daughters accepted without question, repeating the ritual as though it were tradition. Servants continued to handle the gloves, continued to store them in wooden boxes, and continued to remain silent. The cycle of ignorance endured. The wooden boxes themselves played their role. Closed tightly to preserve the gloves, they trapped damp air within. The smell of herbs faded, replaced by the musty odour of mildew, yet women ignored it. A touch of perfume on the gloves was enough to disguise the truth. Once again, appearance triumphed over reality. The story of suede gloves shows how deeply Victorian society valued refinement, even when refinement led directly to decay. It demonstrates how silence protected harmful practices, and how ignorance turned objects of beauty into carriers of pain. The gloves reveal the fragility of the line between comfort and harm, a line crossed daily in households that prided themselves on sophistication. The image that lingers is one of contradiction women drawing soft gloves across their skin, believing they were caring for their bodies, while in truth they were pressing mould and bacteria directly into themselves, servants drying and storing them in secret, occasionally borrowing them for their own use, added to the silent spread of infection, in elegant bedrooms, beneath chandeliers and beside ornate vanities. Sickness spread not through poverty, but through luxury. The misuse of suede gloves reminds us that luxury does not guarantee safety. It shows us that rituals born of ignorance, no matter how refined they appear, can be among the most harmful, and it underlines the cost of silence, for women endured discomfort and illness without speaking, unwilling to question practices that were bound up with pride and tradition. The legacy of these gloves is not one of comfort, but of decay. They were instruments of elegance that carried sickness, symbols of refinement that concealed filth, and traditions that endured only because no one dared to speak the truth. Their softness masked their danger, and their beauty disguised their harm. The story of suede gloves teaches us that refinement without knowledge is fragile, that comfort without care is dangerous, and that silence can turn luxury into poison. These gloves, admired and preserved, reveal how Victorian women paid a hidden price for the rituals of their age. The ritual of suede gloves left women vulnerable to illness, servants exposed to hidden dangers, and households filled with objects that promised beauty while spreading decay. And from gloves, the pattern continued, as other household objects like lacquered chopsticks found themselves transformed from dining tools into bizarre instruments of misguided hygiene. Lacquered chopsticks, brightly polished and decorated with fine patterns, were treasured dining utensils in many wealthy Victorian households. Their glossy surfaces gleamed in candlelight, and their presence on a table suggested refinement and taste. They were imported at great expense, admired as exotic, and carefully stored in ornate boxes between meals. Yet in private chambers, they were often stripped of their intended role. Some noble women, fascinated by their slim shape and smooth tips, repurposed them as tools for personal care. The chopsticks that once touched fine dishes were dragged instead across skin and nails, prying at the dirt and residue lodged between toes. It was a transformation that blurred the line between elegance and filth, creating a ritual both absurd and dangerous. The ritual began after bathing or during moments of grooming. A woman, seated in her chamber, would take one of the lacquered sticks from its case, holding it like a needle. She would bend forward, press its tip between her toes, and scrape away the grime collected from stockings, sweat, and shoes. The stick, though smooth and pointed, was not designed for such use. It tore at skin, scraped nails, and dug into tender tissue. Drops of fluid and small traces of pus sometimes appeared, staining the tip of the chopstick, but instead of discarding or disinfecting it, the stick was wiped casually on a towel and returned to its box. It is almost absurd to imagine a fine utensil, meant for elegant meals, being used as though it were a crude scraper for infected skin. The misunderstanding lay not only in the act but in what followed. These chopsticks, admired for their polish, were not washed properly. Rinsing them lightly in water or wiping them with a cloth was deemed sufficient. The next day, they were placed back on the dining table, ready to be used again for food. Bits of dirt lodged in the crevices and faint stains from earlier use lingered. In candlelight, the sticks gleamed as though pure, but the truth clung to them invisibly. The dangers multiplied quickly. Families who prided themselves on refinement were, without knowing, placing contaminated chopsticks back into their mouths. Bacteria from the skin, fungi from the feet, and residues of pus mingled with meals. Infection spread silently, travelling from body to food and back again. If we compare this to today, it would be like using toothbrushes to clean under toenails and then placing them directly into a child's mouth for brushing. Servants bore much of the responsibility for handling the utensils. They were tasked with collecting them from tables, wiping them with cloths, and returning them to boxes. They noticed stains, smelled faint traces of rot, and felt the stickiness of residue, but they could not question their mistresses. Silence was survival, and obedience mattered more than truth. So the cycle continued: chopsticks for toes in 1 hour, chopsticks for food in the next. The practice reflected something larger about Victorian hygiene. The appearance of cleanliness was valued more than the reality. A chopstick that gleamed on the outside was considered pure, no matter what it had touched. Families boasted of their imported utensils, admired their shine, and ignored the darker reality of their misuse. The contradiction is glaring. The very symbols of refinement became pathways for disease, all because ignorance blurred the boundaries between purpose and ritual. Illness often followed. Members of these households suffered from stomach pains, infections, and unexplained fevers. Doctors prescribed tonics or spoke of weak digestion, never connecting the symptoms to contaminated utensils. The truth that elegant chopsticks were serving as carriers of filth remained hidden beneath layers of silence. Women continued their grooming rituals, households continued their meals, and the cycle of harm endured. Mothers passed the practice to daughters, teaching them that the slim sticks were perfect for prying at hidden dirt. Daughters learned without question, repeating the same mistakes. Generations accepted the practice as tradition, never doubting that refinement excused misuse. To reject the habit would have meant questioning the wisdom of elders, something few dared to do. The chopsticks themselves bore the marks of misuse. Their lacquer chipped, their surfaces dulled, and their tips discoloured. Yet they were polished again, restored as best as possible, and returned to the dining table. Guests admired them, unaware of their secret history. They saw only the surface, not the decay hidden within. I find it disturbing to picture a guest lifting one of these sticks to eat a meal, never knowing it had scraped pus from beneath a noblewoman's toenails the night before. The image is one of contradiction and decay. Fine utensils, symbols of refinement, became tools of filth. Servants obeyed silently. Women endured infections without complaint, and families ate meals laced with hidden dangers. The chopsticks gleamed in the candlelight, but their shine masked decay. The story of lacquered chopsticks is not only about one object, but about a society that prized appearance above truth. It reveals how luxury could hide filth, how silence could preserve harmful traditions, and how refinement could be built upon decay. These chopsticks remind us that beauty on the outside does not guarantee purity within, and that rituals born of ignorance can spread harm even in the wealthiest households. Generations of use left their mark, not only on the objects but on the people who handled them. Infections became common, illnesses spread quietly, and the silence of both mistresses and servants allowed it all to continue. The chopsticks, admired and displayed, carried with them not only patterns of lacquer but also the traces of disease. The misuse of these utensils teaches us that refinement without knowledge is dangerous, that beauty without purpose is hollow, and that silence can turn ordinary objects into instruments of decay. They show us how the boundaries between food and filth blurred in Victorian life, and how tradition transformed mistakes into habits. The legacy of lacquered chopsticks is one of irony. They promised elegance but delivered danger, offered refinement but spread illness, and stood as emblems of a society where appearance mattered more than reality. They teach us that even the most beautiful objects can become harmful when misused, and that silence allows such practices to endure. The practice of using chopsticks for grooming, then returning them to the dining table, reveals the fragile line between luxury and decay in Victorian households. And from chopsticks, the pattern would continue, with other luxurious objects such as lavender sprays being turned from pleasant fragrances into dangerous tools for misguided rituals. Lavender sprays were among the most admired luxuries in Victorian homes. Their bottles, made of glass etched with delicate patterns, sat proudly on vanity tables and bedside stands. A few drops misted into a room filled the air with fragrance, covering the odours of damp fabric, smoke, and unwashed bodies. In drawing rooms, the sprays were seen as tokens of elegance, proof that a household valued refinement and comfort. Yet in private chambers, noble women began to misuse them in ways that turned fragrance into danger. Believing that the same mist which sweetened the air could also sweeten the body, they directed the sprays toward their undergarments. What began as a simple attempt to mask odour quickly became a ritual that scarred flesh, spread infection, and left lasting harm. The logic was simple but flawed. Perfume had long been tied to ideas of cleanliness and charm. If a mist of lavender could make a room pleasant, then surely it could make a body more alluring. Women sprayed the insides of their linen undergarments, convinced that the scent would mingle with their skin and mask anything unpleasant. Some went further, lifting the bottle directly to spray upon themselves. The cool liquid stung at first, leaving a tingling sensation that was mistaken for freshness. But within hours, the stinging grew into burning, and the fragrance gave way to pain. It is almost comical to imagine women proudly perfuming themselves into infections, as though elegance could excuse agony. The problem lay in the contents. Lavender oil was strong, but it was diluted with high concentrations of alcohol. This combination, sprayed onto delicate tissue, stripped away natural protections. The skin grew dry and cracked, and small wounds opened where the liquid struck most directly. Bacteria found easy entry, and infections followed quickly. Women reported itching, swelling, and discharges, yet they did not connect these symptoms to the fragrant bottles on their tables. Instead, they sprayed again, thinking that more fragrance would cover the signs of illness. The ritual spread because it was silent. Women whispered to one another about the secret, praising how the scent of lavender lingered on the body. Servants noticed the practice as they laundered the stained undergarments and handled the bottles, but they said nothing. Their silence was enforced by duty, and they knew too well the consequences of speaking against their mistresses. The bottles kept appearing, the sprays kept stinging, and the infections multiplied. Doctors faced the outcomes without understanding the cause. Women visited them with ulcers, rashes, and sores that would not heal. Physicians described them as female disorders, nervous conditions, or imbalances, prescribing rest or tonics that offered no relief. They never thought to ask about the sprays, for perfume was associated with refinement, not harm. The truth remained hidden behind layers of fragrance and silence. If we compare this to today, it would be like someone spraying disinfectant directly onto their skin and calling it skincare. The contradiction is striking. Perfume, a symbol of elegance, became a source of decay. Bottles admired for their beauty and fragrance carried within them the seeds of infection. Women who sought to appear refined ended up scarred and suffering. Yet they endured in silence, unwilling to admit that their rituals had betrayed them. The fear of gossip, of being considered unclean, outweighed the reality of their pain. Servants, too, bore risks. Handling the undergarments sprayed with lavender and alcohol exposed them to the strong chemicals, which irritated their hands and left raw patches on their skin. They washed these garments in cold water, unable to remove the stains or the stench. In some households, the same bottles were even used to perfume linens for guests, spreading the danger beyond the family. Generations repeated the practice. Mothers instructed daughters to keep a bottle close at hand, to ensure that they always carried the scent of lavender. Daughters obeyed, trusting their elders, never questioning whether the ritual did more harm than good. The bottles, polished and refilled, became heirlooms in their own right, treasured as much for their supposed elegance as for their fragrance. The cycle reveals how appearance once again triumphed over truth. To smell fragrant was considered proof of refinement, no matter what harm lay beneath. The scent of lavender masked the odour of infection, allowing women to continue their rituals without suspicion. They looked elegant, they smelled pleasant, but their bodies carried the hidden price of these choices. I find it deeply unsettling to picture women spraying themselves with these perfumes, smiling at their supposed refinement, while ulcers and sores spread quietly beneath their clothes. The story of lavender sprays is not only about perfume but about the larger dangers of ignorance. It shows how refinement, when built on misunderstanding, can create harm instead of beauty. It reveals how silence protects rituals that should have been abandoned, and how pride prevents the admission of mistakes. It also highlights how fragile health was in a society that valued appearance above all else. The image that remains is sharp women lifting ornate glass bottles, pressing them to their undergarments, releasing bursts of scented mist. The air fills with lavender, masking every trace of sweat or infection. Servants stand nearby, silent, holding the next garment or wiping away spills. Hours later, the fragrance lingers, but so does the pain, spreading deeper with each repeated spray. The legacy of lavender sprays is one of contradiction. They promised refinement but delivered suffering, offered beauty but carried decay, and left scars that perfume could not disguise. They teach us that even the most elegant objects can conceal harm, and that silence can turn luxury into tragedy. The misuse of lavender sprays reveals once more the Victorian obsession with appearance. To be fragrant mattered more than to be healthy. To be praised in the company outweighed the cost endured in private. The bottles gleamed, the scent impressed, and the truth remained hidden. The story of these sprays reminds us that beauty without knowledge is dangerous, and refinement without care is hollow. It shows us how traditions of harm can persist in silence, passed from mother to daughter, from mistress to servant, until they become part of daily life. The lavender sprays, admired for their fragrance, reveal the contradictions of Victorian life. They leave us with the unsettling truth that refinement often came at the price of health, and that silence preserved rituals that should never have begun. The ritual of spraying lavender onto undergarments left women scarred and infected, servants exposed to harm, and households filled with fragrance that masked decay. And from perfume bottles, the cycle continued, with even the combs imported from faraway lands repurposed for uses that spread sickness instead of beauty. Camel hair combs, imported from distant markets and admired for their elegance, became another strange instrument in the rituals of Victorian noblewomen. Their teeth were thick and evenly spaced, their handles carved with care, and their bristles soft to the touch. These combs were designed for grooming hair on the head, but in the private world of refinement, they found an entirely different purpose. Women believed that running the comb gently across the most intimate parts of the body would stimulate circulation, bringing colour and vitality to the skin. It was spoken of as a secret technique, a luxury of the wealthy, something that set them apart from the ordinary. Yet what they were really doing was introducing infection directly into the most vulnerable places. The ritual was framed as health. Women seated themselves in their chambers, often after bathing, and took up the comb as though it were a medical instrument. Each pass of the bristles was believed to draw blood closer to the skin, to ward off paleness, and to maintain youth. The comb felt smooth at first, its camel hair brushing delicately, but its teeth were not truly clean. With every use, small amounts of sweat, skin, and oils are collected between the rows, hidden from sight. The comb was rarely washed with soap or hot water, for fear that the fine material would be ruined. Instead, it was wiped with cloths already damp and soiled from other tasks, then placed back into drawers lined with velvet. The dangers multiplied quickly. Bacteria clung to the teeth of the comb, waiting for the next use. Lice laid eggs among the bristles, undisturbed by half-hearted attempts at cleaning. When the comb returned to the body, it carried not health, but contamination. Women began to experience itching, redness, and sores. Some developed fevers, their bodies reacting to infections that no one traced back to the elegant combs. It is almost absurd to picture women praising themselves for refinement, while dragging across their skin what was, in truth, little more than a decorated nest of parasites. Servants bore witness to the cycle. They fetched the combs, wiped them down, and returned them to their places. They knew of the strange uses, though they never dared to comment. At times, when their mistresses were absent, they used the combs themselves, hoping to imitate refinement. The combs passed from body to body, spreading harm further, carried in silence. Doctors saw the consequences but not the cause. Women came to them with painful sores, chronic itching, and mysterious fevers. Physicians blamed poor air, weak constitutions, or nerves. None thought to suspect the combs, gleaming as they were, symbols of wealth and beauty. If we compare this to today, it would be like people using hairbrushes straight from their pets to groom themselves, believing it improves circulation. The contradiction is clear. Objects praised for elegance became silent carriers of disease. What was meant to maintain beauty instead eroded health. The combs, admired for their craftsmanship, became dangerous precisely because their value prevented proper cleaning. To immerse them in hot water or scrub them thoroughly would have been unthinkable. Better to risk sickness than to risk damage to something expensive. The habit persisted across generations. Mothers taught daughters that combing brought colour to the skin, assuring them it was a secret of vitality. Daughters obeyed, repeating the act without suspicion. Servants continued to handle the combs, continued to remain silent, and the infections continued to spread. The image that remains is of women in quiet rooms, drawing camel hair combs across their bodies, believing in health while spreading decay. Their faces composed, their rituals uninterrupted, even as their skin reddened and their health declined. The combs gleamed, the bristles shone, but the truth lay hidden in the residues clinging invisibly to their surfaces. I cannot help but feel uneasy at the thought of these luxurious combs, polished and admired, while carrying the seeds of disease from one use to the next. The story of these combs reveals the same pattern seen throughout Victorian hygiene. Appearance triumphed over reality, silence preserved harmful rituals, and luxury masked decay. What mattered was the surface shine, not the truth of what lay beneath. The misuse of camel hair combs teaches us that even the most refined objects can become harmful when misunderstood. It shows us how tradition can entrench mistakes, and how silence can allow suffering to endure for generations. These combs, admired as symbols of beauty, left behind a legacy not of health, but of illness. They remind us that refinement without knowledge is dangerous, that beauty without care is hollow, and that silence can turn luxury into poison. In the elegant households of Victorian London, even a comb could become an instrument of decay. The ritual of combing with camel hair left women scarred, servants exposed, and households filled with silent harm. And from combs, the pattern extended further. as even hair wraps and towels found themselves pressed into service in ways that spread not comfort but contamination. Hair wraps soaked in oil, originally intended for nourishing hair, found a strange second life in the hygiene rituals of Victorian noblewomen. On cold days when bathing was avoided, these wraps were taken from dressing tables and pressed into service in ways far removed from their original design. Women wrapped them tightly around their lower bodies, believing the oily fabric would trap warmth and mask odours. To them, it was a clever adaptation, a secret of refinement that kept discomfort hidden. In truth, it was nothing more than a trap for sweat, bacteria, and foul air, creating an atmosphere of decay beneath the illusion of gentility. The ritual was simple but misguided. Women who dislike the chill of washing during winter fastened the wraps under layers of skirts and gowns, letting the heavy fabric cling to their bodies. The oils infused into the cloth, meant to soften hair, mixed with perspiration and natural secretions. The combination produced a stench far more powerful than the odour they hoped to conceal. Yet rather than recognising the problem, women told themselves that the fragrance of the oil still marked refinement. They endured the discomfort in silence, convinced that elegance required it. It is almost comic to picture wealthy women strapping hair wraps around their bodies as though transforming beauty products into deodorant pads. Servants bore the burden of managing these wraps. At the end of each day, they were tasked with unfastening them, wrinkling their noses discreetly as the smell filled the room. They carried the damp fabric away, wiped it half-heartedly with cold water, and hung it in stuffy cupboards. Rarely were they washed thoroughly. Fear of ruining the oils, combined with the delicate nature of the cloth, meant that cleaning was avoided. The result was predictable mildew crept into the fibres, leaving behind patches of mould. When the wraps were used again, the mould pressed directly against skin already inflamed by friction and lack of air. The infections that followed were cruel. Women developed rashes, sores, and persistent itching. Some found themselves feverish, their bodies reacting to the bacteria spreading beneath the fabric. Yet they rarely admitted the cause. To speak openly of the practice was unthinkable. Instead, they described their suffering vaguely, attributing it to weakness or seasonal illness. Doctors, when consulted, offered tonics or ointments, never suspecting that the source of the problem was a hair wrap repurposed as an undergarment. If we compare this to today, it would be like people tying used hair towels around their waist as diapers, then wondering why infections spread. The contradiction was stark. These wraps were symbols of wealth, imported at cost and displayed as luxuries. To use them in such a way was considered inventive, even refined. Yet the reality was one of decay. Soft fabrics became breeding grounds for bacteria. Expensive oils turned rancid, and the bodies of women carried the hidden scars of this misguided ritual. Servants endured humiliation as well. Forced to handle the foul-smelling wraps in silence, they often suffered infections themselves from the constant contact. Their hands cracked and blistered from handling damp fabric soaked in oils and sweat. They knew the danger, but their voices were silenced by duty. To speak would be to risk punishment. And so the cycle of misuse continued, hidden in plain sight. Mothers passed the practice to daughters, framing it as a way to preserve dignity on cold days. Daughters accepted it without question, repeating the ritual as though it were tradition. In this way, habits of decay became inherited wisdom, preserved under the guise of refinement. I find it unsettling to imagine generations of women quietly enduring these rituals, convincing themselves of elegance while surrounded by stench and sickness. The wraps themselves bore witness, their fibres darkened with each use, their oils spoiled, and their seams weakened. Yet they were treasured, stored carefully, and brought out again when cold weather returned. Guests who saw them on dressing tables assumed they were for hair care, never suspecting the truth of their hidden use. Appearance triumphed once again over reality. The story of these wraps reveals the larger pattern of Victorian hygiene. Luxury was prized over practicality, and silence preserved harmful rituals. Women sacrificed health for the illusion of refinement. Servants bore a silent witness, and doctors failed to see what was in front of them. The wraps remind us that even objects associated with beauty can become instruments of decay when ignorance governs their use. The image that lingers is not of refinement but of contradiction. Women sat in parlours, composed and perfumed, while beneath their gowns rancid wraps clung to their skin. Servants cleaned the cloths in silence, and doctors puzzled over symptoms without answers. All the while, the cycle of harm persisted, unbroken by truth. The misuse of hair wraps shows us that refinement without understanding is dangerous. It teaches that silence can turn folly into tradition, and that appearances often conceal decay. These wraps, admired for their oils and softness, left behind not beauty but scars. The ritual of wrapping hair towels around the body illustrates once more the fragility of Victorian hygiene. It reveals how much women endured in the name of elegance, how silence preserved suffering, and how ignorance turned luxury into poison. The legacy of these wraps is not of beauty but of decay. They stand as emblems of a society where appearance mattered more than health, and where silence allowed harmful practices to thrive. And from these wraps, the cycle of misuse continued, with even more bizarre instruments like curling irons being pressed into service in ways that spread harm instead of beauty. Eyelash curlers of iron, heavy and cold to the touch, were designed for the face but found themselves drawn into one of the strangest and most dangerous rituals of Victorian noblewomen. Among certain circles, a belief took hold that every part of the body needed air in order to remain clean. Freshness was not just about perfume or soap, but about the idea of circulation and breath. If skin suffocated beneath fabric, it would decay, and if folds of the body closed upon themselves, they would harbour dampness and disease. With this logic, women began to apply iron curlers, not to their lashes, but to the most private parts of their bodies. The tool, meant to pinch and curl hair, was used instead to hold flesh apart, creating an opening that was supposed to encourage health. The ritual was shocking in its simplicity and its danger. Before bed, a woman would take the curler from her vanity, polish its iron tips with a cloth, and place it carefully between the folds of her skin. Once the curler was locked into place, it held the flesh open. The woman would then lie down to sleep, trusting that through the night, air would circulate freely and keep her clean. The discomfort was immense, but discomfort was considered part of refinement. Pain was reinterpreted as proof of effectiveness. It is grimly absurd to imagine women going to sleep with metal curlers clipped to their bodies, as though they were delicate garments of health. The reality was brutal. Iron rusted easily, and even when polished, microscopic fragments clung to the metal. These fragments pressed into sensitive tissue, causing scratches that grew into tears. During sleep, the body shifted, and the curler dug deeper, leaving wounds that were raw by morning. Infection followed quickly. Women awoke to blood, swelling, and pain, but they continued the ritual nonetheless. The logic of refinement was stronger than the evidence of harm. Doctors began to notice patterns. Women complained of unhealing wounds, constant discharge, and fevers. Yet the cause remained unspoken. No patient dared to admit that they slept with eyelash curlers between their legs, and no doctor dared to ask. Instead, the symptoms were written down as female disorders, nervous weakness, or natural decline. The silence preserved the practice, leaving its dangers hidden. If we compare this to today, it would be like using metal office clips as nighttime medical devices and calling it healthcare. Servants were again caught in the cycle. They polished the curlers with cloths, laid them out on dressing tables, and returned them to boxes in the morning. They saw the blood stains that sometimes mark the metal, smelled the faint tang of rust, and handled the tools without gloves. Yet they said nothing. Their silence was survival. Their obedience demanded. The infections grew worse over time. Some women lost their ability to conceive, their bodies scarred permanently by repeated tearing and festering wounds. Others endured chronic pain that was hidden beneath the layers of silk and lace. Still others died quietly from infections that spread beyond control. Yet the ritual endured, passed from woman to woman as a secret of refinement, whispered as though it were wisdom. The contradiction was striking. Objects praised for their elegance, used to frame eyes with beauty, became instruments of ruin. What was meant to refine appearance instead destroyed health. Women who prided themselves on their knowledge of refinement were, in truth, submitting themselves to instruments of pain and decay. I cannot help but feel a deep unease picturing these curlers, gleaming on vanities, while carrying the memory of blood and infection from the night before. The silence surrounding the practice reflects something larger about Victorian life. Appearances triumphed over reality, and rituals of harm were preserved because they looked refined. A curler polished to a gleam suggested elegance, no matter what it had been used for hours earlier. The gap between public beauty and private suffering widened with every repetition. Generations repeated the ritual. Mothers whispered to daughters that keeping the body open allowed air to flow, preventing hidden decay. Daughters obeyed, repeating the act with curlers passed down as heirlooms. The habit endured, preserved by silence and pride, even as the harm deepened. The story of iron curlers reveals how ignorance and luxury combine to create rituals of suffering. It shows how refinement can mask decay, how silence can protect harmful traditions, and how pride can prevent truth from being spoken. The curlers stand as emblems of a society where appearance mattered more than health, where objects designed for beauty became tools of ruin. The image that lingers is sharp women lying in darkened chambers, iron curlers biting into flesh, while servants tidy the room in silence the next morning. The curlers, wiped but not cleaned, gleam once again on vanities, ready for another night of harm. Guests see only their polished surfaces, never knowing what role they truly play. The misuse of iron curlers teaches us that refinement without knowledge is dangerous, that beauty without care becomes poison, and that silence can make tragedy into tradition. These curlers, admired for their role in shaping lashes, reveal the deeper truth of Victorian hygiene that elegance often carried with it the seeds of decay. The ritual of using eyelash curlers as clamps left women scarred, infertile, and suffering in silence. It added another chapter to the long history of Victorian practices that promised health but delivered pain. And from curlers, the cycle of misuse continued, as even feathers prized for decoration were twisted into tools of supposed cleanliness, carrying with them yet another layer of harm. Peacock feathers were long admired as symbols of luxury and grace, their shimmering colours a mark of elegance that few could afford. In Victorian courts, where every gesture and object carried meaning, women found ways to incorporate feathers not just into decoration or fashion, but into their daily rituals of so-called cleanliness. Among these, one of the strangest practices involved miniature peacock feather brushes kept in velvet or silk boxes, treasured as though they were sacred objects. Each morning before applying powders and perfumes, noble women would open the box, remove the small brush, and sweep it gently beneath their arms. The act was not intended to groom hair, but to rid the area of dust, sweat, and what they imagined were dead layers of skin. To them, it was a refined gesture, a way of treating the body with the same reverence as a shrine. The brushes themselves were crafted with delicate handles, sometimes of ivory or polished wood, sometimes wrapped in embroidered cloth. The feathers, arranged tightly together, gleamed when new, their greens and blues catching the light as they moved. Servants were tasked with storing them in ornate cases, lined with velvet to protect what seemed like precious tools. Every detail of the ritual carried the air of sophistication, from the smooth movement of the feathers against the skin to the pride with which women believed they had mastered personal hygiene. It is almost comical to think of someone brushing their armpits with the same seriousness as sweeping a parlour floor. Yet in their minds, it was refinement at its peak. What began as a luxurious affectation quickly became a source of hidden decay. Feathers, once plucked and cut, no longer carried the protective oils of a living bird. Instead, they absorbed sweat, perfume oils, and the faint traces of blood from small scratches. With no knowledge of germs, women rarely thought to wash the brushes. At most, they might shake them out or wipe the handles. The feathers, trapped in closed boxes after use, became damp and stale, taking on a smell that no amount of perfume could mask. By the end of a few weeks, the vibrant colours dulled to murky greens and browns, and a sour odour clung to the once treasured tools. Servants, responsible for preparing these brushes each morning, were forced into silence. They noticed the change in colour, the sticky clumps that formed, and the unpleasant scent that lingered on their hands. Yet to speak of it risked insult. The brushes were symbols of refinement, and no one wished to admit that elegance could harbour rot. Women continued to sweep their armpits with them each day, ignoring the discomfort and redness that appeared after use. The act was too ingrained in their routine, too closely tied to the image of cleanliness they wanted to project. The physical consequences became difficult to ignore. Tiny scratches from stiff feather spines created openings in the skin. Bacteria thrived in the damp environment beneath layers of lace and silk. Rashes spread, followed by infections that produced swelling and pus. Doctors, when consulted, blamed corsets or diet, never suspecting that the culprit lay in the feather brushes women proudly kept in their dressing rooms. If we compare this to today, it would be like someone using a decorative feather duster as a daily hygiene tool and continuing even after it turned mouldy and foul. For the women themselves, the practice carried a sense of superiority. They believed they were imitating the rituals of faraway cultures, borrowing exotic symbols for their own use. The peacock, long seen as majestic, was imagined to lend its beauty to those who brushed with its feathers. Pain and irritation were dismissed as the body's adjustment to refinement, much as tight corsets were defended despite the bruises they caused. What mattered was appearance, not health, and appearance was defined by what looked expensive and rare. Inside their homes, the brushes occupied pride of place on vanities. Guests sometimes noticed them in open cases and remarked on their loveliness, never guessing how they were used. A tool that should have been discarded after weeks of foul use was instead paraded as evidence of elegance. The irony was sharp, a symbol of beauty turned into a carrier of disease, displayed without shame in the very spaces meant for grooming. I find it disturbing to picture these women lifting their arms each morning, sweeping away at skin already raw, while believing themselves more refined with every stroke. The silence around the practice echoed through the hierarchy of the household. Servants used the brushes secretly when mistresses were away, either out of curiosity or to feel for a moment as though they shared in noble refinement. In doing so, they exposed themselves to the same risks, spreading infections back and forth between classes. A single brush might touch the skin of several people across weeks, carrying microbes invisibly through its once dazzling feathers. The household became a cycle of hidden contamination, wrapped in the illusion of elegance. As with so many Victorian habits, reform came slowly and often only after scandal. Some doctors eventually traced cases of persistent rashes and ulcers to the use of feathered instruments, though they struggled to prove it without the tools of modern science. Whispers circulated that brushes kept in closed cases encouraged decay. But these whispers were drowned out by fashion's louder voice. To give up the brushes was to admit ignorance, to abandon what had been adopted as a marker of sophistication. Pride outweighed reason, and the ritual endured far longer than it should have. The story of the peacock feather brushes reflects the contradictions of the age. It was a society that claimed to prize morality and refinement, yet tolerated filth hidden in plain sight. It was a world where the symbol of beauty could become an agent of illness, and where women clung to dangerous rituals rather than risk embarrassment. The brushes were not unique in this regard, but they stand out as a clear example of how appearance triumphed over substance, and how ignorance could turn luxury into a hazard. The image that remains is unsettling boxes of embroidered cloth opening each morning, the smell of damp feathers escaping, and noble women smiling as they brushed beneath their arms, believing themselves elevated by an act that was slowly poisoning them. The servants nearby held their tongues, the doctors misdiagnosed, and society admired what it never understood. These feather brushes, meant to clean, did the opposite. They spread sickness, they mocked the idea of hygiene, and they exposed the fragility of a world built on appearances. They teach us that refinement without knowledge leads not to beauty but to decay, and that silence can turn absurd rituals into lasting traditions. The daily use of miniature peacock feather brushes reveals not only the dangers of Victorian hygiene, but the stubbornness of belief in the face of harm. Their story fits neatly into the larger picture of an age that dressed itself in grandeur while tolerating rot beneath. And just as feathers became tools of false cleanliness, so too would powders meant for charm be twisted into practices that only deepened the cycle of harm. Sea sponges were prized in Victorian homes as signs of refinement, often used for the delicate care of the face during daily washing, soft, porous, and absorbent. They seemed almost miraculous to women who associated them with luxury imported from distant seas. At first, they stayed in basins filled with scented water or beside bowls of rose infusion, but habits changed, and sponges that had been pressed gently against cheeks soon found themselves used for something far more invasive. The belief spread that a sponge, once boiled in water, became perfectly clean and could be safely reused for intimate cleansing. What began as a beauty tool for the face became a makeshift instrument for internal washing. The ritual appeared simple on the surface. Each week, sponges were gathered into pots of water, placed over open flames, and left to boil. The rising steam carried a false promise of purity. Women believed the heat drove away all danger, leaving the sponge as fresh as the day it was plucked from the sea. Once cooled, the sponge was stored in small ceramic jars or wrapped in embroidered cloth until it was needed again. When the time came, it was soaked in warm liquid and used for internal cleansing in the belief that such a ritual was not only hygienic, but also refined. It is painfully ironic that tools meant to symbolize luxury were boiled like kitchen rags and then trusted as instruments of health. The flaw in the practice lay in its half measures. Sponges, dense and full of hidden cavities, did not become sterile by a brief boiling. Many of the microbes died, but many more survived, trapped in damp channels where heat could not fully reach. And once the boiling water cooled, the survivors thrived. The sponge, thought to be purified, became an even more fertile breeding ground for bacteria and fungi. With each use, women exposed themselves to greater risk, and with each cycle of boiling and reuse, the risks multiplied. Servants bore the worst of the labour. It was their task to collect the sponges, fill the pots, and keep watch over the boiling water. They inhaled the acrid steam, their hands reddened by the rising heat. They knew the water was not changed between rounds, that sponges from multiple uses shared the same pot. By the time they wrung the water out, a sour smell clung to their fingers. In time, many developed rashes, fungal infections, and sores on their hands, silent witnesses to a ritual that harmed them as much as it harmed their mistresses. If we compare this to today, it would be like people sterilizing medical devices in soup pots without changing the broth, then trusting them to be safe. The women who used the sponges spoke of cleanliness, yet their bodies bore the marks of decay. After repeated use, irritation appeared first as redness, then as swelling and burning. Ulcers formed in sensitive areas, and discharge stained the linens. Many suffered in silence, ashamed to admit the pain, fearful of being judged as unclean. Doctors, when consulted, often dismissed the complaints as female weakness or natural imbalance, never suspecting that the sponges lauded as refined tools were in fact carriers of infection. The contradiction was striking. To the outside world, the possession of fine sponges suggested wealth and refinement. To those who used them, the reality was suffering concealed behind silk and lace. The boiling ritual gave a false sense of security, a way to believe in cleanliness while preserving dangerous habits. Pride and ignorance reinforced each other, ensuring the practice endured. I find it unsettling to imagine these sponges, gleaming on vanities in ornate jars, hiding within them the remnants of countless infections, waiting to be used again. Inside noble homes, the cycle repeated week after week. Boiling did not cleanse, it merely disguised decay. The sour odour grew stronger with time, yet it was excused as the natural smell of the sea. Women clung to the illusion that they were elevating hygiene, when in truth they were submitting themselves to harm. The sponges, objects of luxury and trade, became silent agents of sickness in practice. Generations of women participated, passing the custom on as though it were wisdom. Daughters were taught that boiling was enough, that such rituals distinguished them from the lower classes.